From the beginning, the Egyptian collections in Turin, Florence, and Naples, the three most important in Italy, were imperial projects. In Turin, the Regio Museo Egizio, literally the Royal Egyptian Museum, was founded in 1824 by the Savoy. In Florence, the Medici Grand Dukes and their inheritors, the Habsburg Lorraines, collected Egyptian and Egyptian-inspired materials, known as Egyptiaca, and created some of the first museum collections separated and categorized by Renaissance and Enlightenment ideas of natural hierarchies. Here is a painting of the Tribuna degli Uffizi, and here you can see a box statue that comes from ancient Egypt that's still in the Egyptian collection in Florence today. This painting was painted between 1772 and 1777. So you can see how early these things are being considered really extremely valuable parts of the collection to be painted over this large-scale project. These ideas help to support and amplify support for scientific racism, whether by accident or design, and persist today as categories for collecting and display. In Naples, the Real Museo Borbonico was the Bourbon equivalent to the Turin and Tuscan collections. While writing and artistic depictions of ancient obelisks and other monuments in terms of ownership, conquering, and supremacy already existed in ancient times, and were used as justifications for chattel slavery and the subjugation of non-European populations for hundreds of years already at this point, it is during the turbulent post-Napoleonic times that these convictions began to amplify significantly in Italy and in other parts of Europe as they struggled to form a unified national identity. Now, keeping in mind that the Napoleonic expedition is only 30 years prior to Champollion and the Franco-Tuscan expedition, the publications of the colorful plates and drawings in the description of Egypt that resulted from Napoleon's campaign shocked Europe. Not to mention how deeply and immensely offended the Italians were at the conquest of their own peninsula, and the sacking not only of their own cultural heritage, but of the important objects taken in Roman times and later from other conquered lands. I refer to this as reactionary colonialism, and I think it heavily informed their push back into Africa. I think that's a really under-discussed point that could use some clarification. So shortly after the foundation of the Museo Egizio in Turin, arrived a particularly important Frenchman, Champollion, the man who rediscovered how to decipher hieroglyphics. It is no coincidence that during the height of imperial collecting, he chose to go to Turin and Florence rather than to Egypt to verify whether his system would function on different types of objects such as papyri and obelisks. This was followed by his participation in the Franco-Tuscan expedition seen here with Ippolito Rossellini, sponsored by the Grand Duke Leopold II of Tuscany and King Charles X of France. It is considered the first scientific expedition to Egypt, where measurements, photographs, and drawings were done to capture the context of artifacts as they were discovered systematically for the first time. In 1826, the Royal Academy of Sciences in Turin teaches several courses based on the archaeological collection under the heading of Moral Sciences, Historical and Philological, one of which describes an ancient Egyptian measurement system and how it was renewed in Piedmonte. So the language of ownership over Egyptianness is not only about physical and spatial conquest, but also over their ideas and innovations. At the same time, Champollion and others are facilitating sales and further collecting of Egyptian objects. So there's an aspect of monetary value that goes into the worth of these collections. Whether you can afford to collect something, whether you can afford to erect an obelisk. These are all things that have historically, in Italy at least, been really tied to the collecting of Egyptian material culture, especially large-scale pieces. In the years after the unification of Italy in 1861, the capital was moved first to Turin, then to Florence, and then eventually to Rome a decade later. Around 20 years later, after that, Ernesto Schiaparelli becomes the director of the Florentine Egyptian Museum by winning a concorso al Premio Reale per l'Archeologia, a royal prize, a royal concorso, to become the director of the Turin Museum. So you can see on the left, there's the description of his work. And in that description, it talks about how there aren't enough experts, Italian experts in Egyptology, to know whether he's actually good at what he's talking about. So they bring in two Frenchmen and they verify that he's good, and he wins out over the man who's a specialist in Italian local archaeology. So he was renowned for the precision of his archaeological drawings and notations, but between 1903 and 1906, he somehow manages to illegally import the relics from an entire excavation he conducted at Deir el-Medina in Egypt, despite strict governmental controls. For him and those who sponsored him, it was more important to possess the objects than to obey Egyptian law and respect their right to self-determination. I conducted an internship at the Museo Egizio of Turin in 2017, and part of the work that we did there was a chapter that I published in their catalog for a temporary exhibition about the history of the arrival of the objects. And we went through as much as we could, and we could not find any information about how he managed to illegally export 6 large crates of of Egyptian artifacts to Italy without any governmental permissions or seals. All the paperwork is either missing or destroyed or never existed. So that's interesting, to say the least. We have already seen how during the pre-fascist and fascist period, there was an explosion of neoclassical architectural and public works projects, which took place nationwide on an enormous scale. Modern obelisks and other neoclassical monuments were erected to revere the quote-unquote glorious dead who fell in battle to preserve the empire in Africa. On the left, there's an example from Piazza Tasso in Florence. The Egyptian lions were moved to the staircase at the Altare della Patria. Palm trees were planted in many public squares and gardens. A large number of them still stand today. And those are silent nods to colonialism. So if you know, you know, and if you don't know, oh, it's just another tree. So as I walk through Florence, I have a vastly different visual experience because it's on my mind. Whereas if you're not used to reading that kind of imagery visually, it just becomes background noise. Oh, of course palm trees are Italian. Why wouldn't they be? We're tropical, but that's not the case. An ancient Egyptian obelisk was discovered near the remains of the Isam Campense and was erected to commemorate the Italian soldiers who Sam already described fell at Dogali. Torlonia described that particular monument as coming from the soil as rinsed with Italian blood. Advertisements, newspaper articles, touring club guides like the one with the map shown here. This is the Touring Club Guida d'Italia for 1929 for the Procedimenti e Colonie. And I have the physical book here if anybody wants to look at it after the fact. All of these serve to create, reflect, and amplify attitudes about the importance of empire to an Italian identity. Content warning for the next slide, racist imagery, advertisements, and cartoons. So here you can see on the left a description from the Domenica del Corriere della Sera where there's an implication in the caption that the youth of Italy is restored in the quote-unquote summer colonies, places where you could go on vacation and celebrate your Italianness in the warmth by the sea. And in the center and on the right you can see a series of cartoons. In this particular one, they're singing a song called Faccetta Nera, which is a colonial anthem, basically, about how a small black girl, an Ethiopian girl, needs protection, and the Italian troops go and save her and bring her back to Italy. And here in the center, you can see these little Italian children dressed as soldiers who are freeing the people from their shackles. And these remnants cannot be separated from the intellectual and political landscapes in which they were created. Fascism cannot flourish without an emphasis on a narrowly defined group identity. The references to empire were not removed after the fall of fascism, nor redressed through public campaigns or with updated museum labels. Instead, they became a sort of cultural background noise that still influenced the way many Italians still perceive their role in the world. For example, Fendi now occupies the Palazzo della Civiltà Italiana, inside of which is inscribed part of Mussolini's speech about the invasion of Ethiopia, again, which Samuel described earlier. Neither the building nor the inscription has any sort of identifiers as to these cultural contexts. It reads as an endorsement of this celebration by a world-famous fashion brand, or if not an endorsement, certainly an acceptance. Essentially, by not contextualizing or removing these images, they help to normalize the importance of Italy as the natural successor of Rome, the benevolent empire ruling over parts of Africa. In the same way that the material culture of fascism remains, although not directly discussed, Italian advertisements and conceptions of Afro-descended people in popular culture are often quite offensive because the discourse about them being problematic is ignored or written off as, you're too sensitive, they're just jokes. These concepts are difficult to unpack for a general population who has not been given the right tools to do so. When challenged on these ideas, even many younger Italians who have had access to the internet their entire lives, and therefore presumably have more exposure to ideas from outside communities, often respond with the cliche, but we went to build roads. I have certainly heard that defense enough times that I have stopped counting. So I wanted to show some of the justifications for colonialism from the 1930s that emphasize that sort of civilizing aspect of Italy. Before fascism, the democracy in power conceived Africa as an adventure. Today we conquered the empire, past tense. We begin a new creative cycle of race and civilization. This cycle is reaffirmed in the restoration of the Italian right to expand. The colonies of Oriental Africa shall not be considered as colonies of territorial and commercial exploitation. The system applied by other European powers was limited as the extraction of resources and tributes. Fascism will create a new system of demographic colonization by transplanting in Africa all the means of our civilization. He goes on to describe how they also need to prevent racial mixing as part of that. So they're going to essentially move a bunch of Italians into Africa and hope that the populations never mix and that Africans learn to be civilized. One of the most visible examples of this phenomenon in recent years has been the public and political response to the Egyptian Museum in Turin's attempts to make the museum more accessible to Egyptian and other Arabic-speaking visitors. For full disclosure, I was a curatorial intern when this program was enacted. In addition to creating labels and audio guides in Arabic, they also offered workshops and tours led by North African women from the local community, as well as free or 2-for-1 entry into the museum for people who presented an identity card in Arabic. And specifically, they had discussions about how they were thinking about limiting it to Egyptian and Sudanese, but if you have no one of Egyptian heritage working at your museum who can even tell the difference or can't read Arabic, then they decided to make it a broader pan-Arabic solution. Some responses were harsh, and included in these responses were videos taken inside the museum to prove that the museum was anti-Italian. The use of a photograph of a veiled woman became a right and center-right party talking point regarding women's rights. There was a call to stop using Italian tax-paying citizens' money to support xenophobia against Italians. Newspaper reports in the Corriere della Sera, the Repubblica, Il Giornale, and even Huffington Post Italia did not cover any aspects of Italian colonialism as part of this discussion. There was no wider public discussion about how and why the Museo Egizio exists in the first place, the repercussions of colonialism on cultural heritage, links to modern immigration and public policy, or even the issue that no one at the time who had a permanent position at the Museo Egizio actually came from Egypt or had Egyptian heritage. And no one of Egyptian or Sudanese heritage who possessed an Arabic ID card was quoted or asked to respond in any of these major newspaper articles. Many of the major voices in that pushback were right-wing politicians who were attempting to gain or even regain a political foothold. You might recognize the attitude of Salvini in this quote, "Razzismo contro gli italiani pazzesco. Ovviamente giornali e telegiornali nasconderanno le cose." Racism against Italians, it's crazy. Obviously, journalists and TV journalists are hiding things. Meloni, who you can see there, confronting Director Greco of the Egyptian Museum in a picture, I think, purposely designed to make him look quite aggressive, went even further. Ricordiamo che il Museo Egizio di Torino prende sovrinenze pubbliche e finanziato coi soldi degli italiani. Se volete un governo di patrioti, non votate per chi censura la lingua italiana. Mette il velo alle donne e usa i soldi pubblici per questa iniziativa senza senso. Il 4 marzo scegliete un governo di patrioti, votati Fratelli d'Italia. So she's actively using this to say, you're taking Italian money, you're suppressing Italian language in favor of outsiders, vote for our political party essentially look at this woke ideology. You do not want this as a part of your future. Vote for us. She actively solicits these votes by calling on Italians to reject the inclusion of Arabic voices in favor of Italian ones, by implying that they were mutually exclusive and that Italians should take precedence because they are the ones currently caring for the objects in the collection. You'll note she makes no discussion of why that is. There are efforts to push back on ideas of colonial ownership and the glories of empire that persist in Italy. Black History Month Florence and the Recovery Plan, for example, an Afro-descendant library space, collaborate with public and private institutions to provide talks and workshops in order to facilitate discussions between Afro-descendant people, ethnic Italians, and others. They worked with Palazzo Pitti in the fall of 2022 to launch the exhibition Congo by Sami Bologgi, whom you can see here, which illuminated pre-chattel slavery diplomatic connections between the kings of Portugal and Congo, and showed how valuable fabric from Congo was often compared to the famous textiles from Florence specifically, to say that Italians are saying this, that the ones coming from Congo are superior in texture, design, and decoration. However, the exhibition needs a guide due to extremely limited labeling. Exhibitions in such popular spaces have the potential to go a long way to educating the general public, but by virtue of Florence and Rome's popularity as tourist cities, the effect on exhibitions like these can be limited to visitors to the country. Is it possible to recontextualize these spaces on a national level without government buy-in? The emotional reaction to imperial nostalgia is a very difficult one to uproot. It provides a sense of pride in one's culture, a personal sense of importance, of somehow contributing to the advance of civilization and progress, an emotional connection to one's perceived ancestors, and a sense of natural or inherited superiority over an external group or groups. It is a long-term and complex project to undo that work anywhere, but especially in Italy where the imagery is so pervasive. The sheer number of positive visual reinforcements and references to colonialism, fascism, and other systems of exploitation and oppression makes the prospect quite daunting. I will end with a brief discussion of one of the most famous of these pieces, Mussolini's obelisk. The 300 metric ton white marble piece is inscribed with his name in Latin and was erected in the middle of a sports arena just like one of the Egyptian obelisks brought over and erected in ancient Rome. Underneath it is buried a codex in Latin, which describes how Mussolini took Italy from ruin back to successful empire. Using language that echoes the Roman Emperor Augustus's res gestae, it should come as no surprise that Augustus was also the first Roman emperor to have the wherewithal to import an Egyptian obelisk, already ancient even then, and erected in his own arena. So this is a direct callback. The codex is particularly interesting because its existence and placement beneath the obelisk imply a future in which fascism and Mussolini's obelisk had fallen much as many of the Roman ones once did. However, in this imagined long-distance future, the people who excavate its remains, and may be attempting to resurrect it as medieval and Renaissance Romans did to ancient obelisks, are still able to understand Latin. The codex was written by classical scholar Aurelio Giuseppe Amutucci and was reconstructed from archival sources, since the original is, of course, still buried beneath the obelisk. And it was not advertised, unlike every other aspect of the obelisk's erection, so it's clearly not meant for the modern population to be thinking about. So what effect does having such blatant reminders of Mussolini and other colonial figures, ancient and modern, on prominent display in the city's center have? Trajan's column emphasizes how peacefully and orderly his soldiers were while defeating the Dacians, including their completion of new construction projects. This was possibly in order to calm the local Roman population's fears about an aggressive army returning to Rome. We went to build roads, indeed, has a long history. Certainly, whatever sentiments these monuments and memorials inspire must be amplified and cumulative based on the sheer volume of both ancient and modern images available. I think the only fitting response is to close with a quote of a small portion of Shelley's 1818 sonnet about the buried remains of a broken, colossal statue of a pharaoh discovered in Egypt. This is prior to the decipherment of hieroglyphics, so people are guessing at who this is, what he might depict, but he's been lost to the sands of time for centuries, millennia, before he's uncovered. Imagine, as I read this, a Rome where, like the Egyptian language in ancient times, Latin has been completely forgotten, and the buildings and statues of long-dead rulers have little historical context. And on the pedestal, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Perhaps one day a similar poem will be written for the colossal remnants of Italian fascism, forgotten, incomprehensible, and unimportant.
Thank you for that fascinating talk, which we can come back to in all sorts of angles at the end with the discussion. But we'll move immediately on to our next speaker, who is, I believe, known to everyone. Gianmarco Mancosu is a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Languages, Cultures and Society. He is teaching fellow in modern and contemporary history at the University of Sassari and is, of course, also a visiting fellow here at CRASH. His interests are evident in the nature of today's symposium, so I will just mention his book, which was recently published, Vedere l'impero, l'istituto Lieux e il colonialismo fascista.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, the organizer who selected my paper. No, sorry. Okay. Beth has just mentioned in her presentation the colonial nostalgia in Italy. And in the following 20 minutes, I will present some preliminary results of an ongoing research which deals exactly with histories of colonial association and nostalgia in modern and contemporary Italy. I will specifically focus on some lieux de mémoire coloniale, meaning not simply sites where memory crystallizes and secrets itself as Pierre Nora, yet as cultural and physical space in which memories are in constant motion. In other words, those sites are not static repetition of past events, but contexts in which the recollection of the empire is, to a certain extent, determined by present circumstances. And I'm gonna start with two quite telling examples here. I just wanted to have Mattarella. Okay, here we are seeing President Mattarella paying a visit to the Sacrario d'Oltremare in Bari the last November 1922. That is the memorial for the fallen soldier overseas. It was inaugurated in December 1967, and the memorial now houses the remains of over 75,000 soldiers who died between the 1940 and the 1940 and the 45 in Africa and in the Balkans. However, contrary to other war memorials in Italy, the soldiers who are commemorated every year in Bari did not die to defend their own country, but they died in the wars of aggression that Italy unleashed against other countries. Another, and to a certain extent more telling example, materializes here in this part of my slide. There is a bell tower. It's called Campana Africana. It's very close to Rome, and it was being erected in the mid-80s and placed in a sanctuary nearby Rome, in Santa Marinella. The bell is called, as I said, the African bell, l'Africana. It was benedicted by Pope John Paul II in 1983. And if you Google on the website of the Associazione Nazionale Reduci Rimpatriati d'Africa, the National Association of African Veterans and Returnees, you read this sentence. So, every year in Santa Marinella, we celebrate this ceremony, a requiem for all the Italians who've fallen in Africa. The dedication of the rite is engraved in Latin on the bronze surface of this bell. Eis qui African tanquam patriam dilexerunt, and getting back to the significance of Latin in this discourse, and to those that who loved Africa as their homeland. So these two examples clearly show that notwithstanding a palpable, tangible, growing scholar, artistic and social awareness about the most shameful sides of colonialism, its mnemonic configuration is always a battlefield, borrowing from Luisa Passerini. And today I'll provide you some examples dealing with the strategies through which Italian association of former settlers and returnees coped with the transition from the imperial to the, let's say, post-colonial scenario, pointing out a multifaceted set of action in between multiple geographical, political and social sides. Moreover, my talk will invite us to disentangle the memory of fascism of that of colonialism in order to assess the real and enduring result of this latter experience in the making of modern and contemporary Italy. And I will specifically focus on two case studies. The first one is the Associazione Nazionale Combattenti e Reduci d'Africa, so the National Association of African Soldiers and Veterans, in the aftermath of World War II, but broadening our horizon and embracing, let's say, a transnational memory perspective, I will shed light on the Associazione Profughi Italiani dall'Etiopia, so Association from Italian Refugees and Returnees from Ethiopia, which was established in mid-70s. And this analysis will prompt reflection on the crucial transformation and memories of Italian association operating in Italy and in the former colonial space, who recasted their collective identities and memories around some significant physical space and cultural tropes. So just to provide you a bit of contextualization, okay, Mattarella, thank you. Okay, the end of the Italian fascist empire in Africa intersected with the most significant period of turmoil occurring in modern Italy, that is the fall of fascism, of course, the end of World War II, the national reconstruction. In the aftermath of World War II, despite the genuine anti-fascist ethos that inspired the Governo di Unità Nazionale, the national unity government, those post-fascist governments actually requested that the colonies acquired before the fascist invasion of Ethiopia be returned to Italy. So Italy's diplomatic effort aimed at regaining a form of direct influence, political influence, over Libya, Eritrea and Somalia, where significant Italian communities were still present and some economic and political interests were still in place. However, such a diplomatic effort brought to a result far below Italy's expectations, and Italy obtained only the decade-long trustship administration of Somalia, which lasted until July 1960. So when we think about the peculiar Italian decolonization, we need to embrace a very long time span. And this peculiar configuration of Italy's loss of the colonies has undoubtedly affected the ways in which colonialism reverberated in its immediate aftermath, thereby preventing a thorough critique of its effects and legacies. After 1945, the memory of Italian colonialism started to be characterized by an inescapable dichotomy, the simultaneous presence and absence of the colonial past, which was concealed at some moment and revealed at others, quoting J. Winter. It was part, this recollection, of inconsistent cartography of recollection, able to build a certain public narrative of that experience, and helping also to rebuild national identity, shattered by the fascist experience. So, the entanglement between selective and biased memories and active silencing of the most famous sides related to the imperial past was orchestrated mainly by the African Office, the Ministero dell'Africa Italiana, which was still operative until 1953, exactly to manage the discourse, the narratives, and the political activities about the diplomatic efforts Italy was undertaking to keep a control over the colonies. Likewise, all colonial lobbies and associations were not suddenly disbanded as it happened in other imperial experience and decolonizations. On the one hand, colonial institutions like the Istituto Coloniale Fascista simply changed its name in 1947, becoming the Istituto Italiano per l'Africa. And on the other hand, new associations blossomed, animated by former settlers and refugees who returned from the now former colonies. And their activity contributed to fashion partial, selective memories of the colonial past. So those colonial associations were animated by figures linked to colonialism to different degrees, mainly colonial administrators, soldiers, entrepreneurs, explorers, but also enthusiasts. One of the most remarkable examples is the Associazione Nazionale Combattenti e Reduci d'Africa, so ANCRA, established in Rome in 1947. It was animated by Ciro Persichelli, an Italian military official who served during the occupation of Ethiopia. Once Persichelli came back to Italy after his experience in Africa, he started to collect his memories about his African experience, and in 1947 he founded the Associazione Nazionale. According to the founding document, according to the charter that I've studied at the Archivio Centrale dello Stato, basically, the association aspires to protect the spiritual heritage and prestige of those Italians who operated in Africa. So the charter then mentions the determination, I'm quoting here, to revive, remember, preserve, and keep the cult of our dead alive, who passed away heroically in Africa, by possibly collecting their mortal remains scattered to bury them in specific Italian cemetery, end of quote. So this eschatological and religious ethos returned in the aftermath of the former colonial experience. Moreover, explicit reference is made to the assistance towards the Italian refugees who were forced to leave the colonies during World War II, as well as towards those who repatriated afterward. And one of the most recurring activities of the ANCRA was the celebration of a Requiem Mass in memory of Italian soldiers and settlers who died in the colonies. For instance, we have evidence of a Mass held in Rome on 27th of November 1947 in the Santa Teresa Church to remember, I'm quoting here, the heroes who died to defend the city of Gondar exactly 6 years before. Likewise, another Mass was held in the prestigious church of Santa Maria degli Angeli, very close to the Stazione Termini, for those who are familiar with Rome, on 31st of April 1948, on the 7th anniversary of the CIRN battle, that is the battle that sanctioned the collapse of the Fascist Empire in 1941, in the Horn of Africa, of course. Although the association charter states that the ANCRA is a non-political and non-religious association, the entanglement between nationalism and Catholic symbols is evident. The reference to heroism of soldiers and settlers assume an eschatological perspective as soon as they sacrifice their life in accomplishing the mission civilisatrice. Moreover, the annual liturgy of colonial memory, which is celebrated in the above rituals, was meant to create a new calendar of colonial remembrance. It seems that the ANCRA, along with other colonial associations, aimed at keeping alive a kind of colonial temporality to be fully entangled in the new course of post-fascist Italy. So I think I can suggest you a first disentanglement between the fascism, Catholicism, and colonialism, which need to be reassembled in colonialism, Catholicism, and just putting aside fascism, as was happening to a broader level in Italy, according to political and cultural dynamics. All these elements stands probably out looking at the material produced by this association, especially a significant publication issued in 1950 and entitled Italia ed Africa. So this book collects contribution by authors clearly related with and supportive to the Italian presence in Africa. The essays and articles present the national colonial past as an experience of labor migration, and it was totally consistent with the broader post-war narrative of Italians as good worker and good migrant throughout the world. But, of course, this carefully obliterates the usurper, brutal, and racist result of that experience. And the intervention by Piero Chiminelli well epitomizes this element. So, his long essay explored in depth the profound reason that pushed Italy to colonize Eritrea, Libya, Somalia, and Ethiopia, by concluding with this word: la colonizzazione italiana delle 4 ex colonie è stata di purissima marca ideale ed elevatrice. Come cattolici sappiamo a meraviglia che ogni stirpe deve saper dare e ricevere per mettere in comune tutti quei doni che assommandosi devono formare la ricchezza e la gloria del mondo migliore di domani. So, in these words, but in the whole article, the religious ethos here not simply justify Italy's renewed presence in Africa, yet it marks the difference between the Italian and Catholic civilizing mission and that of non-Catholic countries, which according to Chiminelli have pursued commercial and political interests only. And this is a rhetorical discourse very present in the Italian colonial discourse since the end of the 19th century. So, the activity of the ANCRA contributed in the conspiracy of silence about colonial crimes, which might be caused by I'm quoting here Dietmar Rothmund, by a feeling of shame, of discomfort, an unwillingness to articulate repentance for deed which one might not have done, but which one had tolerated. End of quote. And this paradigm fittingly applies, in my opinion, to the uncertain recollection of the imperial past we are dealing with today, in which the silencing and the reworking of the colonial period were peculiarly intertwined as dynamics. The opening contribution of the book is by Guglielmo Nasi. Some of you may have met him in his studies, an Italian colonial general and former governor of Harar, one of the 6 administrative regions composing the Fascist Empire in the North Africa. In his essay, L'opera dell'Italia in Africa, Nasi describes thoughtfully all the agricultural, infrastructural and social projects implemented during the imperial presence, whereas mentioning only obliquely the use of violence that, according to him, was neither significant nor systematic. To confirm such an understanding, he mentioned the fact that Ethiopians would have protected some Italian in 1941, when Allied troops entered the country. So, the underlining and let's say underscoring question here is, if Africa does not criticize the colonial past, why should Italy do itself? In so doing, the collective mnemonic processes assume a transnational and even transcultural dimension, involving their former subjects yet in a totally passive way, in that their alleged opinions are essentialized and bent to the Nazi discourse and, broadly speaking, to the former sectors' agenda. And the transnational dimension of the partial recollection of the colonial past is even clearer while we look at some processes happening in the former colonies between the end of the 40s and the 70s. So in the 40s, as I just briefly mentioned, notwithstanding the end of the former Italian presence, a significant number of Italian former colonized remained in the Horn of Africa. You have some figures here, and especially Asmara in the 40s and in the early 50s remained de facto an Italian city. A great number of shops, restaurants, music halls, and cinemas were run by former colonizers. But as soon as Eritrea was federated to Ethiopia in 1952, something started to change. The presence of Italian decreased, you can see some figures there. But Italians still played a pivotal role in the economic, political, and social life of the city and of Eritrea as a whole. However, let's say a major turmoil occurred when Haile Selassie unilaterally decided to end the federation by forcibly annexing Eritrea at the end of the 50s. So the situation here soon escalated in a violent 3 decades long conflict, which indeed impacted the Italians living in Eritrea. Some of them returned to their homeland, whereas the majority of them moved from Asmara, Eritrea, to Addis Ababa. Between the late 50s and the early 70s, the remaining Italians, former settlers, lived a kind of post-colonial utopia in Addis Ababa, where they found a favorable economic and political environment, prompted by Haile Selassie, actually. I would like to draw your attention on architect Arturo Mezzedimi. You can see Mezzedimi here. Mezzedimi arrived in Eritrea in the 40s, and he was probably the most famous Italians working in Eritrea and Ethiopia between the 40s and the mid-70s, as he planned numerous buildings in Asmara, but especially in Addis Ababa, given his close friendship with Emperor Haile Selassie. And I would like to draw your attention on the famous African Hall, like the building hosting the African Union, which was exactly projected by Arturo Mezzedimi. I would like to read its significance in the complex process of transnational memorialization of the previous colonial period. So at a more general level, we are the models of the African Hall, and this is a real picture. We are in the early 60s. At a more general level, for Haile Selassie, the construction of that building would have meant the materialization of the Pan-African utopia. The African whole thus made concrete the blueprint of the political design of African decolonization. However, there is a further understanding of the symbolic, meaning that that building, designed by an Italian architect, could have represented for the Italian community of former settlers still living in Ethiopia. This is because it allowed the praise of the Italian industriousness even in the post-colonial scenario, by almost forgetting the previous colonial past. So it's a kind of Lieux of post-colonial memoir. For instance, in the journal article that appeared in Il Giornale d'Italia in June 1965, we can notice a praise of the Italian activities with the journalist Carlo Schreiner, describing all the good relationship and practices between Ethiopians and Italia by concluding his piece with the following words. So, l'Africa muta volto, il progresso si avverte nelle sue città che hanno tutto il segno del lavoro degli europei. L'indipendenza ha dato ali ai progetti, ai sogni, alle illusioni, ma in questo nuovo mondo un posto onorevole hanno e continueranno ad averlo gli italiani. So, this kind of post-colonial Ethiopia dramatically changed in September 1974. The Emperor Haile Selassie was dethroned by a socialist junta, the Derg, which ignited a period of brutal repression called K-Sibir in Amharic or Red Terror in English. The economic and political uncertainty prompted by the socialist revolution and by the nationalization of foreign property compelled most of Italians to leave Ethiopia, as it happened some years before in Gaddafi's Libya. Arturo Mezzedini was a key figure also in this new context. In 1975, he returned to Italy along with most of Italians because of the expropriation. And in the peninsula, he played a crucial role in representing the interests of both the Italian returnees. He founded the Associazione Profughi Italiani d'Etiopia, the APE, and he was basically at the forefront of the legal dispute through which the refugees asked a form of compensation to the Italian government for what they were forced to live in Ethiopia, also prompting the implementation of legal devices aiming at the inclusion within the economic and social life of Italy. So, since the 80s, the association was also actively involved in the assistance of needy Italians who remained in Ethiopia. Several events were organized to collect like money and goods, and a regular bulletin like this one was issued. And looking at those events, publications, like written records, we can point out the complex transnational mnemonic mechanisms according to which the APE members recollected their African past, the trauma of the nationalization by the Derg, and the coming to terms in a homeland where most of them had never set foot in. The bulletin published on the 15th anniversary of the APE in 1990 well epitomizes all these feelings by describing a kind of idyllic context for those Italians who remained after the end of the former colonial presence, so in the 50s, in the 60s and the 70s. Yet also the allegedly strong connection, economic, yet also emotional, that allegedly still bonded Italy and Africa. So the memories surfacing from the activity of the APE hence accommodates and juxtapose disjunctive experiences and temporal dimension. We have the colonial past, the post-colonial time, the present-day reality of Italy and of Ethiopia. So the divide separating the past and the present is somehow suspended. This kind of heterotopic dimension of colonial memory, in which fears and fantasies of former settlers are projected, in fact was quite at odds with what was happening in Italian society since the late 70s, where colonial topics started to be critically tackled by scholars also in public debates. I can mention Angelo Del Boca, Giorgio Rosato, Alberto Sbacchi, so on and so forth. So, the biased and nostalgic recollection of the African past served to create a collective memory that, according to Maurice Holbox, is instrumental in defining a sense of common destiny and belongings within a given group. For the members of this nostalgic association, such a social function of the collective memory aims to freeze the past in the present and to place individual memories against the backdrop of a broader mnemonic dimension, perpetuating the notion that, I'm quoting here Charles Burdett, Italian colonialism was different to that of other European powers, and that it is the fitting object of veneration rather than inquiry. End of quote. So, To wrap up, the multiplication of nostalgic association in post-war Italy invites us to think how the former settlers and returnees coped not simply with the end of the imperial dream and with the traumatic return in a very different metropolitan context. Rather, they had to face, or to avoid, a direct confrontation with a growing awareness about colonial crimes, which I've said has been prompted by historiographical and political debates since the late 70s. This altered post-colonial temporality can be observed still nowadays, in that some of those associations are still alive and persist in crafted nostalgic events and critical discourses about the national past. I mentioned at the very beginning the annual masses by the Associazione Nazionale Reduci Rimpatriati d'Africa. I can add also a series of celebrations held in the Piccola Caprera Mausoleum, close to Mantova, where a small museum post-colonial connection, Beatrice knows more than me, and where annual masses are celebrated to remember colonial soldiers and settlers. So the last examples prove that there are some lieux de mémoire where the decolonial transition is suspended, and the intermingling of material and immaterial memories of colonialism still haunts our present time. So the urban and cultural spaces where the former Italian settler fashioned their post-colonial identity and memory are thus alive with a ghostly presence, debris of the empire that, far from being inactive, still invade our everyday life. So it is important, in my opinion, to consider counter-memories of the empire. That is the nostalgic evocation crafted in different phases of the 20th century, as discourse that challenge an inclusive way of remembering. It's only from this consideration that we can develop an enhanced consciousness of the contemporary context of colonial memory in Italy. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Gian. That works perfectly with Brett's earlier presentation, and that sets up a whole series of questions for us to follow through in the discussion in a minute. So we'll move in just a second to our third speaker.
Yeah, Simone is ready.
Who is
Simone, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I am. Can you see me? Yes.
A couple of words about Simone Brioni, who is, I'm sure, known to all of us. He is Associate Professor in the Department of English at Stony University. His research focuses on migration studies, with particular emphasis on contemporary Italian culture. Just to mention, Somali within 2015, it's also films about colonial, post-colonial, transnational encounters, Northbound, Rock, and most recently, Beyond the Frame.
Okay. Thank you, Charles, for this generous introduction, and thank you, Gianmarco, not only for inviting me, but also because it was thanks to our dialogue that I've developed some of the reflections that I'm presenting today in this film. Today, I would like to talk about a film that I made with director Matteo Sandrini called Beyond the Frame, which features writers Cristina Lifara. This is a meditation about colonial photography. Has an Italian producer, 5-6 Film, and distributor, OpenDDB. Subtitles produced through a didactic laboratory, which was held here at Stony Brook, a soundtrack composed by a musician based in Brussels, and features 2 Italian protagonists who live respectively in Brussels and Long Island. So it is the result really of a transnational endeavor. And the film will premiere on March 21st at the 32nd Festival Cinema Africano, Asia, America Latina in Milan. So I lived in my hometown, Borgo Stollo, between 2020 and 2021, after being away for 20 years. And it was an uncanny experience. On the one hand, I was able to reconnect with my family and with many of the people I had known since I was a kid. On the other hand, I discovered that so many people from my village were involved in the colonial enterprise. And in particular, I came across a box of photographs taken by a distant relative, Giulio Brioni. Although I dedicated my professional life to study the legacy and memory of colonialism, I had no idea about this relative. Giulio worked as a military photographer from 1934 to 1936 in Eastern Africa. He died at 24 years due to an infected wound months after returning to Italy. Most people I interviewed did not describe him as a fascist supporter, but nonetheless, he went to Africa, died because of the Italian colonial campaigns, and contributed to the dehumanization and expropriations of colonialism. My emotional responses to Giulio Brioni's colonial photographs compelled me to reflect upon the contrasting feelings that I was experiencing. Even if I did not participate in the trauma of the oppressed and the victims of colonialism, I did not align with the oppressors either. To borrow Michael Rothsberg's terminology, I was an implicated subject, bearing vicarious responsibilities for things that I had not done. But, like it or not, I benefited from the privileges that resulted from the colonial enterprise. The interrogation of my own position as an implicated subject was not an easy process, and Noor Bakhter's soundtrack to the film recreates this feeling of uncertainty and discomfort which I perceived while I was examining these pictures and feeling implicated with the story they testify to. So, making a film was for me a way to confront this uncomfortable feeling. Something that Matteo and I agreed upon since the very beginning was that we didn't want to present an objective perspective. We wanted to create a situated personal viewpoint. We didn't want to make a historical documentary, but a personal essay film. The saturated colors of Jane Yoon's poster show this intention. And I'm grateful to Loredana Polezzi for suggesting to use these colors. This intention can also be seen in the sequences that superimpose real footage to the images and extra diegetic sounds, thus showing that reality and history are seen through an effective and personal filter. Beyond the Frame attempts to revitalize Giulio Brioni's photographs, and it can be described both as a remediation, an autoethnographic exploration, and an example of anti-racist visual activism, which reflects upon the relationship between photography and power. Beyond the Frame is a remediation because it attempts to transform an archive into a medium, a film, through a performance. It attempts to create a connection or a mediation between these photographs and the audiences that the film addresses. But it is also an attempt to provide a remedy or at least an explanation for the damage and the pain that these photographs has caused. The film presents about 100 colonial pictures, which I analyze in a voiceover. These comments on photographs, I believe they have a potentially transformative value as they attempt to resist the colonial gaze and they exemplify and reinterpret. They reinterpret colonial history and reflect on how this colonial past shaped the present. But Beyond the Frame is also a film inspired by autoethnography. This documentary represents my personal experience in finding these pictures as a way to understand a broader cultural experience. And as such, it is both a product and a process, a reflection about its own making. The film focuses on how colonial photography expresses the domination aspiration by the colonizers, discussing the problems of preserving biased memories without a proper reconceptualization. In other words, it discusses the relationship between photography and power. Shooting a picture implies an ethical choice and what Pierre Bourdieu calls symbolic violence, the containment of a complex reality into an object that can be possessed. Photography, indeed, cameras were frequently associated to weapons. So Giulio Brioni's pictures express an ambition of colonial domination, even if perhaps this was not his conscious individual intention. Or to use Masa Mengiste's word, they are both tools of remembrance, but also tools for erasure. And I just would like to give you a couple of examples to comment on a few frames of the film, to give you an example of this violence, of how photography claims to portray reality and to be a testimony, but it implies a specific perspective and a point of view on reality. This picture, for example, epitomizes what Nicholas Mirzoff calls white sight. The picture is characterized by the elevated vision of the photographer or the viewer. And this elevated vision, it is, quite recurrent in these images. According to Mirzoff, this white sight always sees from above because it serves the land and places all life under surveillance. The image also constructs Africa and Africans as primitives, and several pictures actually emphasize this aspect. And I would like to comment again on the picture by referring to Masa Mengiste. She writes about a colonial photography of a similar topic. When you look at the picture of a warrior with pride, with a shield and a spear, and it looks dignified, it doesn't look like a negative or stereotypical photograph at all, until you realize the photographer and the man should be enemies. Then the fact that the photographer is still alive says something about his power and not the person who is being photographed. It's a photograph of domination. A second frame that I would like to comment on is this frame from the movie. Oltre ai bordi indeed reflects upon...
Simone, yes. Non stai condividendo lo schermo forse? O si è bloccato qua? Prova a ricondividerlo.
Ok.
Perché noi siamo fermi alla prima slide.
Ah, no. Okay, I'm very sorry.
I thought it was like on purpose.
No. Sorry. Sorry about that. Okay. Very sorry. Okay, so let me perhaps see if it's like this. Yeah, I'm very sorry.
Yeah, it's your first one.
Okay, so these are all the traces of...
Yeah, okay.
Yes, this is the box of photographs. Yeah, sorry. There is also, it's quite interesting, the use of Holocaust here. These are the pictures from my relative. This here is a poster.
Yes.
this is the, yeah. And this is the image about a weapon, and this was the image I was commenting on before. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so moving forward, this is the frame that I wanted to comment on. The film reflects upon and attempts to unbuild the infrastructure of power that are aimed at claiming certain spaces at white, also by looking at how streets named that celebrate colonialism metamorphose the city into a white space. In this case, it's the dialogue with Uba Cristina Lifara, who is an expert in whiteness and what it does as a brown writer. She explains how she feels in this environment. The names of the colonies in the Italian streets do not only mark the territory, but they also show that the space is meant for white, and therefore it excludes from it non-white subject. They reduplicate, here are a few more examples of streets named in Brescia. These street names, they reduplicate in the metropole the process of Italianizing the colonial space, which was carried out by colonizers in the colonies. A third example that I would like to consider is, a third example of this white site can be found in this picture, which was not only taken by a white soldier, Giulio, but it also portrays white soldiers, and it's meant to be seen by a white audience. But what strikes me about this picture are the white statues on the back. This picture was taken at Foro Italico, which still today has inscriptions celebrating colonialism. These statues, chromatically and in the racializing sense, had the role of constructing whiteness as an idealized model. The idea of race is, of course, a fiction, and these statues are a materialization of this white supremacist ideology as they associate whiteness with beauty. The proximity of the white soldiers to the statues is not just physical, it is also ideological. They represent people which are more human because they are more similar to those models of ideal whiteness. And Africans look so different from these statues, and think about the previous picture, are also less human. But the film also portrays what Mirzov calls white holes, spaces in which these monuments, or better said, these infrastructures of whiteness are removed. Here is an example in Piazza Vittoria in Brescia, where one of these statues of a white, young, virile man called Era Fascista was removed by partisans and substituted in 2017 by a cubist statue made with black marble. Era Fascista is not just a statue, but a database that has established and preserves a norm of white supremacy and toxic masculinity. And the same can be said by other symbols of this past, such as this relief of Mussolini. The more I was writing and making the film, the more I realized that I had analyzed and discussed the view presented in these photographs, rather than offering alternative ways of looking at them. Photography is much more is much about what is in the frame, but it is also about what is not captured, what is beyond the frame. The end of my journey to discover the traces of colonialism in Brescia and Borgo Satollo brings me to meet writer Uba Cristina Alifara and to interrogate the first part of the documentary and its ability to see beyond the frame. Alifara is the author of the novel Little Mother. She was born in Italy and spent her childhood in Somalia, and she currently lives in Belgium. She highlights some aspects of these photographs that appear important to her, a person of African descent who experiences the colonial legacy on her skin every day. To some extent, Beyond the Frame can be also considered an autobiographical inspired film, as it acknowledges how the works by writers such as Alifara and Mengistu have changed the ways in which I consider my work as an Italian studies scholar. But what was left beyond the frame? Giulio's experience in Africa did not have exclusively a personal dimension, but also a collective one. It was not just a family memory, but also a public memory. Beyond the Frame interrogates whether this collective dimension includes or excludes colonized Africans, inviting us to consider their perspective too. In other words, the final part of the film highlights the dangers of a single story, and I'm referring to Chiamananda Ngozi Adichie when talking about colonialism, and shows that memory is the result of conflicting narrations which need to be depicted in their complexity. So, in conclusion, by reimagining and commenting on Giulio Brioni's photograph, Beyond the Frame attempts to deconstruct the colonial gaze and reclaims the many spaces which today still celebrate colonialism in Italy's public life. While colonial photography was aimed at creating a separation between blacks and white, the film ends by advocating for a dialogue which includes people who share different experiences and identities in order to try to come to terms with this past. Dialogue is the force that shape, and I'm paraphrasing Nick Mirzoff again, a way of seeing that expresses the will of hospitality rather than a will of power, and makes another world, hopefully a decolonized world, visible. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. That works perfectly with the earlier two presentations. We have the great thing about this symposium is that we do have time for a proper discussion. Yes, thanks. There are all sorts of things that we can come back to here. And just to mention just one or two, we can talk about, I mean, this is the space really to talk at the end of the day about the meanings of narrative, the way that they're embodied, the way that they continue, the way they don't respect borders, the way that they're embodied. That will be certainly one thing that we can start talking about. We can, but there are many others. We can talk about transculturation, the way in which that works. We can talk about subjectivity, and we can also talk about the nature of reality. What do we mean by reality? It may, in fact, perhaps what we really discussed in this session and the day as a whole is that debris isn't something that just you can find and locate, and it's everywhere. It's a metaphor for talking about reality. And in some way, perhaps that's a good place to start. What does this tell us, or what are the three papers tell us about the nature of reality? It's a massive question, but it's emerging extremely strongly from each of the three talks. What does one mean by reality?
Well, let me start by saying something. So I didn't realize you were going to talk so much about Catholicism. Ernesto Schiaparelli, in one of his early trips to Egypt, founded the association to give succor to Italian missionaries abroad in 1886. So essentially, this is before he becomes director of either of the Italian museums. And what is happening in these museums cannot be untied from what is happening as part of the larger Catholic and general colonial discourse. He's an active participant. He's running this society. He's dealing with Jesuit missionaries abroad. He's dealing with the suppression of Jesuits in other places. He's dealing with issues of collectionism, which can't be untied from Jesuit missionary collectionism, which is extremely problematic. So it's really interesting to see that these ties go further and further and further and further in terms of how much they still have effects. And that society still functions today. So it's one of those situations where you look at the Egyptian Museum and you think, okay, here's an archaeologist, he's a scientist, perhaps he's a political person, but there are so many other aspects to his behavior that have knock-on effects throughout the Italian Empire. So initially, when I first started looking at his behavior, I was thinking, here's a man who, okay, he's being raised in and growing up in and then becoming an adult in pre- and then fascist Italy, but there was no indication in any of the museum exhibitions that I saw or any of his direct writing that's kept at the museum that he was actively thinking about oppression of Africa or etc. It was more like, oh, he's such a scientific man. He wants to do things correctly. He wants to show like complete pictures of the ancient past. Because the correspondence is kept in two different places. Again, like what I said with the Egyptian and Greco-Roman pieces that come from Tivoli and Rome, in ancient times they were displayed together. In modern museums they're displayed separately because of racial hierarchies that don't exist. And the same is true about all of these artificial hierarchies about, is this a topic of colonialism, is this a topic of Catholicism, does this belong to personal papers that we'll never see. So in this sense, he's only one man. It's kind of overwhelming to think about how many other people are having these same aspects of their lives that we still haven't even touched, that we still haven't really been thinking about, or that some people know this aspect, some people know that aspect. And because it's difficult for fields like classics and Egyptology and archaeology and then fascist studies, etc., we don't overlap a lot in many university institutions, in many conferences, for the same reasons that these objects don't overlap in museums. It's a long-term problem. It's going to take a long-term solution. And I really do think, obviously, pulling in source communities makes things much more comprehensible to people outside of our fields. So I think that's one easy way to really start thinking about how to readdress our issues. For me, that means collaborating with Egyptians when I have funding and they don't. That means talking to people who don't have access to museum spaces and seeing how they interpret things. That means talking to people in religious communities, etc. It's a lot of collaborative work that is needed to do the kind of things that we're talking about.
Okay. John, do you want
Yeah,
to...
well, the nature of reality is a very big question actually, but I'll shift the attention from the singular to the plural. So what a matter of realities that we are embedded, also simultaneously. And when I study the colonial nostalgia, I feel that there is this kind of contrasting temporalities and contrasting way in which memory construct different realities and different projection of the future, actually, because as I said also at the very beginning of the conference, looking at something that seems still like a ruin actually questions us about the nature of our own reality, of the transiency of our life, but also of the transiency of the social models and also of the historical experiences. So it's just a matter of complexifying the idea of reality and of temporality. That's the reason why I try to stress the fact that nostalgia, like the recurrent concept of utopia, is just a matter of shifting the gaze and try to create a different future, which sometimes it's not an inclusive one in the case that I have addressed, but it's just a matter of pluralizing the perception of reality. And in that specific case, colonialism has been like one of the most striking experiences in the history of humanity, because one of the like classical rhetorical devices was saying that the people we are going to colonize are out of time. So we are bringing them reality. We are bringing them the Western temporality, which I mean is something that really like it's truly entangled in Western society, in the Western way in which we are still looking at different contexts.
Thank you, John. And Simone, just on this subject of there is no such thing as time, just as there is no such thing as reality, there are realities that are contrasted, multiple, proceeding at different speeds and in different dialectics. So, yeah, some comment on, yes, the nature of reality.
Okay, thank you, Charles. I guess, I mean, making this film was a way for us to resist the reality that was presented in these photographs, which wasn't really a reality, but was a heavily ideological view, ideologicized view of Africa. But I think that was really the most difficult thing that we have to do by making this film was really to resist the beauty of the composition of these photographs, the well-organized structure of these photographs. It was also a way to resist, the fact that, this person looked so much like many of my relatives, etc., and kind of to detach myself from that, from the story that these photographs were narrating. So, yeah, I think somehow, when you first look at these images, you have an idea of a reality, but after a while, after looking at them over and over again, after discussing about them, etc., you really see the violence that is present, that this photograph expressed. So, because they are photographs that clearly separate, dissect reality, give an interpretation of reality. And so, through this film, we have tried to somehow restitute a broader and more complex picture, I guess, of that reality.
Thank you. So, questions? Robert?
Well, just as a general question, starting with Gianmarco, I feel like you were kind of critiquing or adjusting the notion of the lieu de mémoire, but I'm not sure you quite kind of told us how and whether, and that seemed to talk, I mean, of course that concept talks to everyone in the room, but it seemed to talk very particularly to both other papers, because all three of you are kind of querying or readjusting this relationship between objects or objects in a museum or photographs as objects or indeed sites and sanctuaries. So it would be very useful for us if you could, like, what's the particular line of critique, because it's such a dominant concept and you were, I think you were stepping to one side, or if not, slightly dismantling it.
Well, it's also Pierre Nora in its original writing, like, separates the milieu de mémoire to the lieu de mémoire. But sometimes this distinction is not so clear, first of all. And this, in the blurred boundaries between the milieu and the lieu, so in a physical space, in a cultural space, or the cultural signification of that physical space, let's say so, there is lots of room for negotiation about the historical meaning which develops around. This is the first line of critique, but the second one, which is the most relevant, is that transnationalizing and post-colonizing the lieu de mémoire, which is like Charles Fordick, Achille and Moudielan have written a fantastic essay on the post-colonizing lieu de mémoire in France, telling that a lieu de mémoire, of course, is subject to methodological nationalism. So we need to expand our understanding to see that in those lieux de mémoire there is this kind of obliteration of the complex histories, of the diverse histories that make nations. So that's the second point that I try to bring into the discussion. And I just forgot to mention this when I passed from the nostalgic association to the transnational Ethiopian association, who started actually in Ethiopia and then moved toward Italy in this very peculiar, of course, lieu de mémoire. But it's a matter of expanding the understanding of the historical meanings around, gravitating around a physical space, which is also, of course, a cultural space at the same time.
But do you want to run with the lieu de mémoire, given that the political nationalistic focus of the lieu de mémoire, the physicality of them, is so much part of your talk?
Well, for me in particular, I think there's an aspect of time that is often not considered when we talk about the lieu de mémoire. Yeah, sorry, words. But basically for me, I'm dealing with both the flattening of the past, so this idea of ancient Rome and ancient Egypt as like these singular moments of glory that then somehow get expanded, so that must have been how they were the entire time, and that's not how it actually works, but that's how it must work for fascism to succeed as glorifying this holy emperor. Rome is never working toward glory. Rome arrives at glory miraculously from the beginning, and maintains that lineage through the modern period. In the same way, Egypt is always one pure Egypt that never changes. They're never looking at Greco-Roman objects in Egypt. They're never looking at things that have heavily influenced contrapposto poses. They're never looking at things that Hadrian added. They're looking at ancient past. And when we think about the fact that Cleopatra was born closer to the invention of the iPhone than she was to the creation of the pyramids, it's very difficult for me to deal with sort of short-term ideas of current images of museums without being very critical about how we look at the ancient past. The difference between 10 years in my life and the political circumstances that are currently happening in the world, and the difference between the way many museums and political and university spaces treat 10 years of the ancient world is a real contrast that I'm struggling to deal with often when I'm trying to talk about how people and place and thing and time relate to each other. I'm doing the best that I can with my 3D models to get a specific time, as close to a specific year or 2 or 3 year period as I can, but that is almost impossible, especially when all of your archaeological data is over a very long term. You never know if something moved from year to year, you only know where you found it and how it was used at that moment. So for me, looking at place of memory and culture of memory is to say that for those of us looking backward, we're looking at a place that changes based on who's looking at it, that changes based on the people who leave. Every time someone leaves a place, they hold that frozen memory of a place in their head, right? So the California that I left 7 years ago is the California that I think of when I think of going home. But if I go home now, nobody in my family still lives there. None of the people that I went to high school with still live there. Who knows what the buildings look like? I've definitely made a wrong turn because they changed the stop sign. And that's in a 7-year period. But it's frozen in my memory. And when I talk about California over here, people assume that I'm an expert because that's where I'm from. But the way that life changes when you leave a place and the way that you interact with your memories of that place often solidifies a sort of conservatism in your sort of consideration of place and time from the other. So I think for me, especially in talking about Italian colonialism, yes, it's long before the internet, but people are writing home and back and forth, and they're sort of mutually celebrating this glorious moment that doesn't exist simultaneously in either place. So for me, that's a really interesting dichotomy. Empire is still going, empire is crumbling from the center. So where do we find ourselves in that discussion? I don't have any answers, but I am interested in the questions.
Thank you. Simone, your work is particularly sensitive to place. I mean, some of the pictures that you were showing us were of almost of theatres of memory, sort of what the photograph itself is a kind of deliberate theatre of memory situated within another very aggressive theatre of memory. So yes, this question, the lieu de mémoire.
Yeah. So basically, in order to make this film, I have really walked a lot. I really went to the places that celebrate the memory of Italian colonialism. I took pictures at all of the street signs to see where they were actually located in the urban geography of my city. For example, this image actually comes from the cemetery, from Borgo Satuallo Cemetery. There is somehow a tomb. This is a monument which is somehow separated from the rest of the tombs, and it's right at the entrance of the cemetery. I've passed by it, growing up several times, but I actually never noticed that there was this picture actually celebrating. Can you hear me?
No.
Yeah, we can hear you, but we can say it's okay. Carry on. We lost the screen for a second.
Okay, yeah. I never noticed that there was actually this tomb and this monument. But perhaps something that I have discovered by making this film was actually that in Brescia, not far from where Giulio Brioni lived before moving to Africa, that neighborhood was called the Libyan neighborhood because Italy imported workers from Libya to work in the fonderia, so in factories in Italy. It was quite interesting to actually rediscover there are no traces except in the memories of some old people that this part of the city was actually called the Libyan neighborhood. So for me, it was really like to rediscover a history of a city that I thought I knew, but actually I didn't.
Thank you. Comments, questions, observations, both about this session, since we're reaching the end of the symposium. Yeah,
I have a question for Beth. So I know you study kind of ancient Rome and ancient Egypt, but kind of in the late 19th century, there's kind of this resurgence of Italy's presence in Egypt, kind of with Giuseppe Verdi's production of Aida, and then kind of the continuation till their expulsion in the 50s. Have you seen their kind of presence in more recent quotes, times on kind of Italy's relation with Egyptian artifacts in the Egyptian Museum or in your research in general?
Well, in particular with the restructuring of the Museo Gisu in Turin, there's been an increase in discussions between, obviously, the two governments and between the Museo Gisu in Turin still conducts or leads excavations in Egypt now. They've restarted that process. There was also a production of Aida, first performed in Turin, for the unofficial opening of the Grand Egyptian Museum in the main courtyard 2020 in February, for the International Association of Egyptologists conference that happens every 5 years. So there's a lot of, and anecdotally, I was in Egypt in this December, and there's quite a lot of discussion by local Egyptologists about what's happening in Turin and about Italian interest in excavations. Interestingly enough, because of the construction of the Grand Egyptian Museum and because of the massive loans that Egypt has had to take out for that from Japan, there's a lot more East Asian concessions for excavations that are going forward, and there's a lot more happening in East Asia. But because many Western Egyptologists consider Egyptology and Egyptian archaeology as the sort of purview of Westerners, and occasionally Egyptians who are rarely welcomed into the fold, they're pretty much not speaking to each other. There's not a lot of dialogue. I think I'm the only person I know who intends to eventually learn Japanese as part of my Egyptological training because I can see where it's going. But I think for me, there's a lot of emphasis on what Italians think of Egypt and not a lot of emphasis on what Egyptians think of Italians, and they think of you a lot less than you think. Basically, it's really interesting because I think as someone from a group that was colonized, there are a lot of people who assume that we must be thinking about people, the colonizers or former colonizers all the time and all of the things that we do. It's very white gaze friendly. When I address talks to Black people, I do not have to make all of the qualifications that I have to make when I speak to white people, which is to say, we know that you have this education and that you are the dominant force in education, but we're going to come at this from a different perspective that you might not be used to, and now I have to give you the basics of that perspective. We are grown up with both perspectives by purpose, by education, by training, and by force. So it's interesting because for me, I'm less interested in what Egyptians have to say about Italians, although of course that's the work I'm doing in the ancient world, is to say what do Egyptians have to say about Romans and what do Romans have to say about Egyptians. But in the present period, I think it would be completely fair to say, let Egyptians speak for themselves and actually listen, give them opportunities. And it's not for me to say.
Other questions or comments? Martina and then Mary.
Thank you. I have a question for all three of you, but all relates to the practice of memory, I guess. So for that, I would be to say a little more, if you want, about the initiative of the Museo Egizio of opening to giving free tickets to people of Arab descent. If that's the wording that they used, okay?
People with Arabic identity,
which is another thing.
Which
Yeah,
is
that's
completely
exactly
different,
what I want. If you want to say more about it and how it, where it comes from, what's the point of it, and what do you think is the mindset behind it? To I'm going to say all the questions and then I stop. To Gianmarco, I know Santa Mariana very well, but I had no idea that thing happened on the 4th of November. My first reaction would be, oh my god, we need to ban it, or I don't know, stop them somehow, but obviously that would be stupid, and so my question is, what could be a sustainable approach to these practices today? Because of course banning, I mean, doesn't make any sense. I mean, who has the authority to ban such things? And I guess that these are born out of some kind of effect, like there must be some kind of affection to that memory, like someone's grandfather died in Africa and left that kind of idea that was like the right thing to do and that was a heroic deed. So there must be people thinking that, can you say something about where this comes from and what, I mean, what to do about it? And to Simone, finally, I mean, it's so serendipitous that those photographs came into your hands, of all people. I mean, you have the preparation to actually make a fantastic job of them. And so my question is purely hypothetical. What would have happened if the same box like came into the possession of someone without your preparation or without the tools that you have? To maybe that box would tell a completely different story to a person who hasn't been, I mean, has a PhD in Italian studies, taken abroad and teaches in a US university. What could be the alternative story of that?
Do you want to start responding, Simone? Then we'll
Okay. Well, I guess it would have probably been, silence, basically, you know? The fact that, we don't talk about these archives, we don't look at these pictures, etc., was really the pictures were actually very small, and we actually had to make them larger, and when we saw them larger, we actually saw so many things that we couldn't see, when we actually hold the material artifact into our hands. I think, probably, silence, not talking about this memory is what has been going on, up until now. Archives, can be so I think the attempt that of this film, but of several other initiatives in these years, is actually to go back to the archives and to work with this material, basically to show the stories that the stories that they are present there. Then of course, I mean, there are different sensitivities, different stories, etc. So we try to tell our own, to see our own perspective on those pictures. That's why I think we didn't want to present it as the story, as a unified, homogeneous narrative or something like that. We wanted to kind of present it more as really a personal story. And I think it was very interesting for us to integrate this personal archive with the Istituto Lieux archive and videos. Somehow, I think by looking at the film, there is also a clash of narratives between, photographs that are, aimed at perhaps the families at home, and photographs that are perhaps used, institutionally from the Italian, from Istituto Lieux for broader masses, to actually show Italians, to actually construct Africa for the Italian audiences.
Thank you. Gian, do you want to?
Yeah, very tough question actually. I think that a sustainable approach and the emotion that rituals and monuments do provoke in people who has a kind of bond with the colonial past are dichotomous. It's basically impossible to envision for them a sustainable approach to criticize, because they are emotionally bonded to that specific recollection. I might add that not only white Italians are members of the Associazione Nazionale, blah, 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 but also former Eritreans, former Eritrean subjects. Now, of course, Eritreans stop. So it's a very complex dynamic of memory, because we are not, what I tried to show in my presentation, that the formation of that memory is disentangled for the fascist experience. Because colonialism is a deeper experience. It's very genetically grounded in the way in which we understand ourselves as members of a nation. And also we are, as Simone says, the only thing that I can envision for myself, but it's not a general answer, is just recognizing my positionality in relation to that history and doing my job at the best. So just doing great research that can address also not only fellow academics, but also people outside academia and people who has lived that experience, and being, as a historian, provide some reconstructions which are telling for them, which tell something that they may spread the seeds of criticism, which it's basically impossible, again, because it's an emotional recollection. But of course, I must add that they are very small events, but there is a constellation of these events, and that's the reason why they tell us something about the constant need to redefine identity of some groups according to memory paradigms, let's say so. Sorry, but I'm not.
Yeah.
The proper answer.
Do you want to add?
Yeah, sure. So the CIRN is a very interesting case, because obviously during the post-war period, quite a lot of Italians from southern Italy were brought up to work at Fiat and other factories up north, and there was a need to create a bigger sense of cultural identity. They have a long print history with Corriere della Sera and everything, and of course the Real Museum from the Egyptian collection then became the sort of national Egyptian museum. It's the one you're proud of. Outside of Italy, it's the best collection available, and it became a constant reference in sort of reifying the idea of what it is to be specifically Torinese. On top of that, during this period, just before 2017, they had run a concorso for who was going to be the new head of the museum. And And it had been the same woman for ages and ages and ages, and she happened to be married to one of the major investors in Juventus. So there's a lot of links to local place, to hooliganism, to other sorts of things that were happening sort of under the surface. And when Direttore Greco got the position, he's Italian, but he had been in the Netherlands for several years. He'd been in America before that. There was a discourse around, is he really an appropriate person? He doesn't live here, he doesn't know the place. So that was that. And then there was the lawsuit between the two of them when she lost the concorso. So this was all happening at the same time. So he's coming in from outside, implementing new ideas, and people got really upset that there was no Italian on the bus adverts for the Arabic ID cards. There was this sense that they deserve to know everything that's happening, and that if something is not for them, it shouldn't be happening at all. And that I find is quite common in sort of conservative national identity politics. I deserve the right to be in on every single situation. And if I can't be in on a situation, if it's not designed for me, it's a problem for everybody else now. So I think that's a lot of what was happening there. And then of course there's the veiled woman problem, let's say, where especially, like I said, referred to Giorgia Meloni, she was using it as saying, how dare you show a veiled woman, she must by necessity be oppressed. I had some Egyptian friends at the time who were students studying engineering at the university, and they were mostly just like, hey, cool, it's free, let's go. And that was kind of the discussion. We did have to avoid the press conferences because I get mistaken for Egyptian on a regular basis, especially at conferences and in Egypt and other things. And I looked just like my friend, so we were both like, okay, maybe we wear a hat over our hair today and like avoid this path into the museum. They're doing a press conference. Things that other people don't really have to think about when they go in and out of spaces. So I think I was more aware of what was happening specifically because of the implications for me and people who look like me. But it was also just a little bit intimidating to realize that even such a little change as putting Arabic labels together with Italian and English labels, or doing audio book guides together with audio guides in French and English and Italian and Spanish, was such a big deal that it would make national newspapers, and there was nobody pushing back in the positive. And there was no pressure on the media to say anything from anyone else's perspective. It was only the right-wing perspective. And Christian Greco standing by himself responding. It was frankly disconcerting, and I think has made it more difficult for other museums to do similar things. I mean, they tried to sail under the radar initially by not advertising except, on the Arabic-only advertisement. So they didn't make an announcement, they didn't make a press announcement, for example. They didn't think it would get as far into Arabic communities anyway if they made a regular press announcement. So they were just like, let's do local advertising. And it wasn't until people found out about it later that it became an issue as such. But yeah, the response was pretty unexpected, even from the point of view of the museum's directors. I don't think they were expecting that level of pushback. So then they had to come up with a press response, and rather quickly. And then he had to stand there and debate people face to face on the street with reporters and microphones and everything, which I don't think was something that he was necessarily expecting to have to do. And together with the lawsuit and everything else happened, it was quite a tumultuous time. Then they kept it going another year or two. I'm not sure if it's still going, but it's still on their website, but the dates are out of date on the website, so it's possible that they don't do it anymore. But, I mean, they still have the problem that nobody Egyptian is working there, right? So, like, invite the community in all you want, but it's still white gays designing spaces for people whose heritage it is to come in and look at it and then go home again. So, yeah, I mean, that's a problem in museums throughout the world, but it's just very interesting from the perspective of they're trying really hard to make it as inclusive as possible, but only from an aspect that doesn't have any financial or like staff repercussions, which is interesting so far.
We're going to go on for another few minutes. We've got a question from Mary, but if anyone, what we might do is just harvest a couple questions and then ask the panel to respond. So Mary, then Beatrice.
I'm happy to forego my question.
No, that's fine. No, this time. Maybe.
Okay, well, so my question was for Simone, and it's partly been anticipated by Martina's question, but I'm interested in the materiality of archives and that wooden box, which we only got, a very quick glimpse of. Yeah, I'm wondering to what extent that was curated in the military and the colonial setting, or to what extent that was made up back home. Where were the photos developed? What was Giulio's role in selecting and curating that collection? Who had looked after them in the intervening period? That kind of stuff. I wondered if you could shed any more light on that.
Thanks, Simone. Do you want to think about that for a moment, and we'll take Beatrice's question and possibly one last question. Beatrice.
It's not really a question, it's more something that came up to my mind, mixing the last thing both of you said, Gianmarco and Beth. So I was thinking about the fact that the Italians that came back to Italy after Gheddafi's coup and they were expelled from Libya, they meet in Anzio every year because Anzio reminds them of Tripoli and they're very nostalgic about Tripoli and they cannot go back, so they meet in Anzio to speak Arabic, together. So just to complicate a little bit more, also this idea of languages and of memories and nostalgia and belonging, because they feel like they don't belong in Italy. And it's questionable for them whether they're just Italians and full stop. So I just wanted to put it out there, and I don't know if you want to comment on this.
Okay, thank you, Beatrice. And just lastly, if anyone does want to ask a last question before we ask our panel to respond. Yep.
Yeah, just a quick one for Gianmarco. Just wondering, very simply, what kind of the role of formal education was in the sort of processes you're talking about around sort of construction of memory, reconstruction of memory, forgetting or the cultivation of nostalgia, and how these sort of very general processes and discourses, are being channeled through formal educational institutions in Italy or in the post-colonial states as a way of kind of buttressing the sort of things you're talking about.
Okay, great. So we could go on for a long time, but if we can respond to those three questions in no particular order, but just we'll begin with Simone. And first of all, the box.
Okay, yeah. So here is a box. There was, I think, the sister of Giulio was still alive, but it was during COVID, and she didn't want to see anybody. So I tried to collect different. I couldn't talk to her, and she probably also had other material that could have been useful for the documentary, but I wasn't able to talk to her. I talked with other people in Borgo Satollo, many other stories of people who, were actually, sent to the colonies because they were against the fascists in one case, or sent to the colonies. This is another distant relative of mine. We are all kind of relatives in Borgo Satollo. Distant relative of mine who actually went to the colonies and then he came back to Gorizia right when Italy actually joined the Allied forces, and so he was interned in an internment camp in Germany as an enemy. So there are very diverse stories that I could collect. These images were mostly, I believe, for his family. There were, dedications on the back of some of them to his girlfriend, to his nephew, for example. So there were, I think, more private collection of photographs that then were sent back home. Yeah, this was all that, this is what we, these are, I wish we had, we could work with more material, but unfortunately we had, somehow COVID was limited our action, but also allowed me to kind of talk to, you know, a lot of more people in Borgo Statollo, because I was stuck there. I couldn't leave my village because of the restriction of COVID. I hope I have answered to your question.
Okay, so Gian, if you'd like to talk about processes of association in formal education.
Yeah, I'm gonna go for it. Well, thanks, Damien. Again, are very complex historical and cultural processes, but to wrap it up, it's just, we can say that the history of colonialism has been not simply removed, which is a word that I don't like it, but has been strongly reshaped and marginalized. And often marginalized, just mentioning the war strength related to colonialism. So Italy invaded Libya in 1911-12, Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1936. That's in the textbooks in Italy. Basically, that's the record. Something is slightly changing right now. But again, when you've got La Sussidiario, so the book that you have at the scuole medio, the elementary school, you find imperialism is something related to British experience, French experience. The imperialism as a complex and overarching experience. That's a problem. That's a huge problem. But again, it's not a matter of removal. It's a matter of politics of memory that has been shaped since the 40s, basically. That were shaped by people previously involved in that experience. So, and totally embedded in that discourse. That's the reason why it's so hard to point out the significance of that experience, and also the, let's say, numerical significance, because Italian colonialism was a demographic experience. So millions of Italians went colonizing or fighting in Africa. They when they came back, they reshaped this kind of experience in a nuanced and, let's say, not critical recollection. I'm gonna also answer to Beatrice's comments. Yeah, that's totally true. I just can mentioning you a personal anecdote. When in Addis Ababa, and I met the children of the former settlers, which are now old people, and the first things they say to me is, tu sei sardo? Of course, I'm sardo, because when I speak, it is quite clear. And they were extremely proud of the fact that Italian in the colonies, and the former colonies, has no accent. They say this is Italiano puro that we speak here. So it's about constructing a linguistic identity, but again, it's getting back to the idea of shape and define the borders of that experience and the replication of that experience in the way in which they describe themselves, they construct social networks, so on and so forth.
For me, it's really interesting because the Africa that they want to go back to doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Never exists, I would say.
It never existed. But again, they are looking back at an Africa in which Italians are in charge of everything, and they get all of these privileges, political and land grants, and all of these monetary and business insiders privileges, and that's the Italy they want to go back. I mean, that's the Africa they want to go back to. So when there's, I feel for them being like, I'm removed from this place where I had such a strong connection, and I don't have any such connection to Italy because I wasn't raised here, etc. I understand that. But similarly to speaking to the descendants of, or to the French people who were evicted from Angola, the way that they often talk about it is quite offensive to people who have suffered under the effects of colonialism. And I think that because many of us are not willing to have that conversation with them because it's more emotional energy than it's worth, they get to maintain that bubble and pass it to their children, and then it makes their children envious for an Africa that they've never experienced, and maintain that sort of mental link of, well, we belong there, why can't we go back, So that's one really interesting thing about the sort of flattening of time and space, like I was talking about. The other is that there's no, how do I express this? Anecdotally again. I have never been to a conference about classics or Egyptology in which, when I state what I study, someone has not asked me whether I'm Egyptian, and when I say no, the response is, without any irony whatsoever, why are you studying Egyptology then? Because the conferences in Europe and the West are overwhelmingly white. But there's a sense of like natural ownership of the white West over Egyptian heritage. And why don't you study your own history? It's very frustrating to get this conference question over and over and over and over and over again. I don't have a response that will shut people down that won't get me in trouble later, so if anybody has any recommendation, I would be very happy to hear it. But yes, it's one of those things, we refer to microaggressions keeping people out of the field. I'm old enough and I've worked enough jobs and I have enough self-advocacy skills that this is not going to impact my sense of like, I shouldn't be in this field. But I know a lot of people who are not in my field anymore because they couldn't tolerate it. They were always the only one in their department, the only one at the conference, and it really wears on you. And until people realize that if you're going to say people outside of source communities can study history, that means everybody outside of source communities can study history. So I don't want to hear, why are you here? Why don't you do your own thing? So until that's broadly applied, we're going to keep having this problem. And we're going to keep having the issue of not having enough other voices to make any difference in that problem. So if you see people who are at a conference who don't look like the normal attendees at that conference, like, try to help them network. They're probably having quite a difficult time of doing it, and they're probably having to deal with quite a lot of attitudes that you might not see on the surface. But yeah, it's a frustrating and isolating experience to be the descendant of colonized people in Europe trying to study anything that's not considered my own history. So I would encourage people to reflect on that the next time they go to an event like this.
That's a very powerful way of ending what has been a terrific session, but an extremely productive day, which we're extremely grateful to everyone concerned. So I'd just like to conclude by thanking everyone.
Well, thank you again to all of you. It was a very enriching day. I promised you at the very beginning that it would have been. I'm super happy and hope that you will find this day like stimulating to different degrees. Thanks again to the CIRN, to the CRASH, and for this fantastic month here. And I think that we deserve a glass of prosecco, or water, or juice. I don't know if Mary, Melissa, Robert would wrap it up with a more institutional goodbye. I don't know, but
no institutional goodbyes, but a massive thank you for Gianmarco. It's been an amazing project.
Hopefully there will be some way to develop this reflection, to build up a network, and maybe to give a concrete outcome to the very powerful, thoughtful, and deep reflection that we have today. Thank you so much for all of you.